Joining me now, Heather Higgins, Independent Women's Voice President and CEO. Fred Fleitz, Senior Vice President at the Center for Security Policy and former CIA analyst. And Christopher Bedford, Editor-in-Chief of the Daily Caller News Foundation. Heather, let me start with you. A few days ago, Nikki Haley sort of hinted or suggested that there was no more room for sanctions. But China coming on board today seems to maybe suggest we might be able to find a diplomatic, economic solution to this thing.
I don't know that it's going to be a solution, but it's something that absolutely had to be tried. And it's also part of the sort of the Trump MO, right? This is what negotiating looks like. You put on the sanctions, but you also say that you're open to talking. Historically, economic sanctions have never stopped a nuclear power from developing nuclear weapons. The only thing that does that is actual regime change, serious fear of regime change, as in Libya's Muammar Gaddafi looking at what happened to Saddam Hussein, or the Israeli Air Force does a strike, as they did, for example, in Syria in 2007. Short of those things, economic solutions have yet to solve what is fundamentally a military or a political problem, but it is absolutely necessary if we're going to try and keep this from becoming a hot war, because we're technically in a state of war with Korea now. Remember, we've got an armistice.
The DMZ.
Exactly. We've never moved to a peace deal, and what North Korea wants is a peace deal to get rid of us so that they can take over South Korea. But we don't want this to become a hot war.
Well, their actions have backfired because they've drawn us closer in, and now everyone's looking for some answer. But, Chris, I think one of the reasons economic sanctions haven't worked with respect to North Korea is China. In fact, last year was the best economic year that North Korea had in 16 years, and exports, trade between China was up 30% so far this year. So this move by this central bank really was a key move, maybe a key monumental shift.
Typically, you're right. We crack down on China. We say, don't send them gas. And then you'll see the next day, China sending more coal than you've ever seen them send to North Korea. They're willing to make money on those guys, and they don't ever want to cut that off, especially since, to your point about the DMZ, they don't want the U.S. Marine Corps on their border. They want them on the North Korean border. This looks a little bit more promising. It's going to make things more uncomfortable for the leaders. And China always has a history of just staying one step ahead of U.S. sanctions. Doing, like the kid doesn't really want to do his homework. They just dot the I's, they cross the T's, and they do the bare minimum necessary to stay ahead. So far, they've done that, but they have told the North Koreans, we won't deal with you. I think it'll make life more uncomfortable. But to Heather's point, this country wants respect, and it's going to demand it, and it wants nuclear weapons, and they've already got them. Right. I don't think this is really going to stop it.
And let's face it, China has a gigantic black market, underground economy, and so does North Korea. A lot of this stuff I don't think the central banks will be able to get a handle on. Fred, what do you make of the silence out of Russia? It's deafening in my mind. They've been pretty quiet this week with everything.
Well, Charles, I think the Russians are very uncomfortable with North Korea testing what might be a hydrogen bomb. To some extent, I think Putin is fine with North Korea creating trouble as long as it is trouble for the United States and for its allies. I think that Kim Jong-un went too far, and we could get something out of Russia also. But
Fred, where did he cross the Rubicon? Where was this inflection point that he went too far?
Well, I think testing a hydrogen bomb, which may or may not be a hydrogen bomb, but a very powerful atomic bomb that was so powerful that Chinese officials are very concerned that radiation may have drifted over the border. That could have been a red line for China, and I think it also probably concerns Russia. There are some experts who are saying,
Fred, let me break this off for one moment because I've got breaking news coming in on this very topic. At this moment, the North Korean state news agency is saying that Kim Jong-un is calling or has just called Donald Trump deranged, says that he will, quote, pay dearly for his threats. Is that the response you were looking for, Heather?
I think it's predictable. That's sort of how we've heard him react before. So it's not that surprising. But I'm sure that Trump is cognizant of that. I mean, for me, and I'm not a scientist, but the reading I've been able to do about it, the big concern, obviously, is an EMP attack, where they don't actually need to be that sophisticated. They don't have to figure out how to get it to land. Sure. They just get it to explode. And as we're seeing from all these hurricanes, knocking out power is a very big deal. There's a lot more that's reliant on power than just your lights. It's your transportation system. It's your water supply. It's food deliveries. It's all sorts of things. And our grid as civilians is not protected. So obviously we want our government to do everything we can to solve this problem before it comes
an
here.
electromagnetic pulse that would come from a nuclear bomb detonation, which, by the way, no one knows how serious it could be. Real quick, Fred, because I also want to touch on Iran. The belligerents coming out of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, to Heather's point, not necessarily a surprise, but what about the next missile test or the next bomb test? Are you expecting that also?
I think that the North Koreans may be considering that, but now they have this response from China. I'm hoping they'll reconsider. I'm with Heather. I'm not optimistic that sanctions are going to work, but we have to go through every avenue short of war before we start talking about attacking the North.
Guys, another global crisis. President Trump pushing to revisit the Iran nuclear deal, and maybe not end it altogether. Iran's president quickly fired back, declaring that the deal cannot be renegotiated. Although, Christopher, we know that the White House every 90 days has to certify this to Congress. I think the next deadline is October 15th. President Trump saying, listen, there's a portion of this agreement that covers unaccountable behavior. Certainly, Iran falls under that.
You're right. And the problem with the Iran deal is that the last administration was so darn desperate to make it, they were literally dropping off pallets of cash. They were sneaking behind the U.S. Congress. They were sneaking behind the U.S. Senate, which is supposed to have oversight over this. They were doing anything they could, and they were ignoring some of the bad and inflating some of the good. You hear this funny term, the moderate politicians who run Iran. There hasn't really been a major difference in how Iran's been run since the revolution. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the Ayatollahs probably run Iran. So Donald Trump has got to look at this deal. So far, we haven't seen much difference. We've seen some provocations from Iran, but there's no way right now for the U.S. to seriously check and make sure that the deal is being followed. I think the president should push for that, and if not, he's got to scrap the deal and start over.